Well, throughout this book, he says that he's offered several arguments to convince you that scientism is false. But what he has not done is to explain how you are to think of the relationship between Christianity and science. How can both of them be integrated together? And if so, can they? And then if so, how? But before we start our explanation of these topics, he wants to give you something to ponder. Based on his experience of more than 5 decades of teaching at a graduate level and reading deeply and widely on the nature of science and the study of Christian theology and philosophy, he would estimate that about 95% of science and theology are cognitively irrelevant to each other.
Wow, that's kind of interesting.
So you can be
so they
a
have
scientist.
Nothing to do with each other with regard to their various ideas and,
Right.
and that sort of thing.
Right. And as a presuppositionalist, we might bristle at that, but I think what he means is kind of that direct experience of it, of being closely aligned. Yeah.
Direct, specific information kind of thing.
Right. So he gives us this example. As a Christian, it just doesn't matter to him whether a methane molecule has 4 or 14 hydrogen atoms. Similarly, debate among Christians could be about the existence and nature of the spiritual gifts doesn't seem to be relevant to chemistry.
So the point here he's making is that really the Bible isn't a scientific book, right? And so, we might argue that in those areas where it touches on science, then we need to consider that. But in general, the Bible isn't a scientific book. It's a different kind of book. And science isn't a, book about religion, right? The scientific process isn't about necessarily. Although, as you mentioned or as you alluded to, there's some overlaps. There's some foundational issues that need to be considered. But in general, I think everybody would agree the Bible isn't a scientific book.
Right, exactly. So spiritual gifts, methane molecules, those kind of fit in their own category. Both are important to get right, but the science doesn't really help or affect the theology of spiritual gifts, and the theology doesn't affect the number of atoms in a molecule. They might talk about the undergirding of why those things are true, or how a single person can have multiple spiritual gifts, but the overlap tends to be few and far between here.
All right. So 95%, he tells us, of science and theology are cognitively irrelevant to one another. All right. So that leaves 5%, right? So what about the 5%, with regard to science? Is there a direct interaction with Christian doctrine he wants us to consider? And he says within this category, the 5% that's left, he would say that 3% of science provides further evidential support for Christian teaching as opposed to evidence against it. So there, 3%, is supportive of Christian teaching. For example, he says the Big Bang and the second law of thermodynamics provides a dramatic scientific confirmation of the Bible's unique pre-modern teaching that there was a beginning of the cosmos, right? So there, 3%, he suggests, is supportive, gives evidential support of Christian teaching.
We're whittling it down so we don't have to do so much explanation.
So we don't have to fight each other so much.
Well, okay, so that leaves then 2%. All right, we're doing good on our math here. So 2% of current scientific claims that may seem to undermine Christian theology. What is interesting to him is that, as far as he can tell, little or none of this counts against the existence of God or the truth of Christianity's core. Rather, most of it counts against biblical inerrancy and current interpretations of specific texts. In fact, interpretations of Genesis 1 through 11 account for much of the conflict between science and Scripture. And again, you're then having a debate on different types of historical scientific explanations. So, the age-old question of were you there, and then what does all the evidence point to? And again, that's why your presuppositions are important, and your understanding of worldview on just how that is. In fact, even the discussion of things like the Big Bang could count for and against depending on if your worldview allows for that type of explanation.
Right. And so he tells us that, as he said elsewhere, that he not only believes that the biblical inerrancy is true, so that's how he comes down on inerrancy. He also thinks it's an important doctrine that we can believe with rational confidence. But he tells us when people talk about conflict, right, between theology and science, it's critical to determine the exact location of the difficulties. So he says science has done more to confirm the Christian God's existence than to undermine it, and science has provided little to no evidence against belief in theism. And so science, he says, has, raised challenges to various biblical texts, and Christians need to take these challenges seriously. But in general, he suggests it It's a confirmation to the various claims with regard to theism that science provides.
And so he wants to move on now to talk about the word integration. Here in the heading integration, conceptual and personal, he wants to take the word of integration to mean to form or blend into a whole or to unite. So if you're baking a cake, you're integrating all the ingredients together and you're forming them, blending them into hopefully something cake-like. And hopefully my wife is doing the cooking rather than me, or it turns out to be a pie, and I don't know how we got here.
Yeah.